The third SaGa game is the third wheel of Game Boy SaGa. Thank you. Ooh, 5 of you. Okay, but really, this game is all over the place. There's a bunch of questionable aspects to the game, and it's easy to make unfavourable comparisons to said aspects. And yet, that's exactly why I find the game interesting. You seeing this abomination of a video game? Final Fantasy Legend 3 is what happens when you take all of Square's RPGs and put them in a blender. Really, this homunculus has it all. A dynamic class system, complex dungeons to backtrack out of, one-off mechanics that work better than they should, an unnecessarily over-the-top soundtrack, a convoluted narrative spanning across multiple planes of existence. It's fair to say that Legend 3 is the awkward transitional phase, trying to be this grand epic while shouldering elements from previous entries. More specifically, this is a combined incorporation of fundamentals from previous Final Fantasy and SaGa games, and in some way, an early sign of the games to expect from Square Enix, for better or for worse. Transformations have seen a large overhaul like your uncle's garage. Instead of selecting a class at the start of the game, now all party members can switch into a monster, beast, cyborg, or robot after an encounter, handled in the same way as the Monster Meat setup, including the human and mutant classes. There are 6 creature types to dynamically customize with, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Beasts deal more damage unarmed, but their stats are limited to the specific creature. It's not as if your goblin is going to be shredded just because you took away their long. Another example is how cyborgs strengthen certain stats sincerely with particular equipment, although they'll need to sell a boxed copy of Legend 3 to afford them. There's even a recontextualization of the stat-ups from the first SaGa, by having them work exclusively with the robot class. Except this time, those upgrades are also more expensive, and the stat boosting won't apply to other classes. Transformations are also easier to telegraph thanks to redefined limitations. The result of the creature transform depends on the character's level, element, and current form. Each transform has its own set of stats and talents, so there's a lot of variety to choose from. These challenges allow for more consistent strategy in building your party, and how to dynamically tackle current challenges mid-dungeon. This would all be great, except there's also the introduction of experience points. I know, it's terrible. More stats have been pilfered from Final Fantasy, along with the same spell names, but more notably you can now level up after accumulating enough experience points. I already mentioned in my Legend 1 video the problems I usually see with how this gameplay aspect is implemented, and here it's especially apparent after it being absent in the previous 2 games. Temporary party members return, but they have fixed levels, and can act as a guideline for the appropriate level for each area. The difficulty of the game is significantly dampened knowing the best strategy is to simply grind levels until your party is at equivalent strength to the passing affiliate. What is this, Neural Samasa? All the earlier stuff regarding dynamic class changing and the variety of talents is meaningless when the default form benefits the most from leveling. The game's hampering its own unique features for the sake of pointed experience convenience. And that's not the only conflicting design aspect. The way you traverse the overworld has a similar progression to Final Fantasy games. You gain different forms of transportation to access different overworlds. That's 5 guys to 5 lands in total, not including excess seafloors or time travel variants. The very first dungeon gives you a float spell that lets you hover over the sea. Then, shortly after, you're able to transport back to the past version of the overworld. Some of these upgrades are attached to your main Talon ship, though there are other useful upgrades like crew members that open up shops, the cannons that fire during aerial encounters, and even the speed of the ship. The Talon really feels like the heart of your adventure when the scenery is constantly changing, as your party tries to push further into increasingly harder to reach territory, and only harder to reach territory. Once you've completed your initial main story quests for a given world, there's usually no reason to revisit the area. Progression is often tied to reaching new locales rather than exploring the world. That's fair enough for dungeons, but this approach feels like a missed opportunity for the tools you're given. I mean, come on, you have a time-travelling airship, and yet there's barely any optional areas to capitalize on your increased mobility. Just a bunch of reused sunken ships and caves. No cool hidden summons or spells, sadly. No kulaks. Really, this new travel is just a different contextual coat of visuals for the linear level structure seen in the SaGa games. Instead of a dense, ever-changing overworld, you instead get a set of smaller linear overworlds whilst travelling on a majestic aircraft. It's all just a straight line, isn't it? So far it seems like the combination of Final Fantasy and SaGa game design has led to questionable outcomes, so how about some more examples where this union has worked for the better? Like how the enemies and boss fights in Game Boy Saga typically have large health because they have nice big hearts. And Legend 3 goes even further. Here's the stats for the Ashura boss from Legend 1. Keep in mind that this is one of the last bosses in that game. Now here's how much health he's got in Legend 3. This guy's only the third boss in the game and he's so chunky. The increased stats have also been accompanied with a variety of attacks, which is important to counteract multiple classes, introduced with the transformation system. This allows each party to have its unique attributes while dealing with certain attacks and obstacles, and those encounters are made more manageable with the revolutionary technique of selecting your target. Ooh. Older RPGs used to love just stacking enemies into one column, but one exception was Final Fantasy. This works well with the expanded repertoire of attacks by giving them a more specific target, like if you wanted to inflict a status condition on a particular foe, like you wanted to mess up that one thing in particular, like that worm. Another cool new feature is the ability to jump. Yeah, check out Mario over there. But instead of platforming, it's a dungeon crawling tool. Although jumping goes over 2 steps, it actually only counts as 1 step. This allows you to traverse more distance, sure, but more importantly, it cuts down on random encounters. Knowing when to jump and how to position yourself could effectively half the encounter rate if you planned ahead. This task mainly becomes engaging with the new dungeon layouts. They've become more like Final Fantasy dungeons, with more winding tangents and sub-areas. Navigating around these tight, intricate spaces whilst considering a jumping route can be challenging, especially when you're trying to avoid obstacles like damaged tiles, conveyor belts, and holes that drop you down a floor. In a sense, the game is rewarding you for paying attention to the environment by easing up on encounters. It's a surprisingly simple solution in connecting dungeon navigation with random encounters. Like, there's an actual skill here, and all they had to do was add a jump button. Eat shiitake, Mario! The soundtrack is very SaGa, meaning it's very repetitive to emphasize tension. All the music is for mystique. Apparently the soundtrack was made to utilize more channels than usual, so in that sense, it is technologically great, even if my ears are bleeding. And the visuals are looking great too. Ambiguity meets technical prowess, like cheese and grapes. Although the smaller enemies can look a bit squashed. It's a similar clarity sacrifice the Final Fantasy games made in order to allow multiple enemy selection, and you may prefer the cleaner look of the previous enemies. After all, this pancake Drake wasn't having issues before, but even with the reduced swag, Legend 3's enemies still seem more detailed, with all these dots on the squid, or this hamburger robot that has room for sawblade arms and zappy wires. Of course, the bigger enemies are quite a sight. Not sure why this guy needs so many mouths. And my favourite enemy is this one where it is casually flexing its brain while rocking a dapper jacket. Zoom in further on that popped collar. Gotta respect the absolute drip on these mad lads. Don't talk to me or my sons ever again. It's rather fitting that this game released just before Final Fantasy V, which also shifted to more detailed looking enemies. You may be wondering why my second character is named Polnareff. Well, that's because the Japanese-only DS remake thought it would be a cool idea to rename all the characters, so Curtis is Polnareff now. Yeah, just wanted to mention that. The story is super grandiose. Cell reproduction, ship customization, actual hell, time travel, casual floating island, water. I love the introduction to this game because it's an absolute sensory assault. These children get sent back in time, and then do VR training for 5 years, so they can do battle with God. This guy gets completely blown up, but then apparently, it turns out the main character was holding onto one of his skin cells. So he gives it to this scientist guy, and he restores his original body, including his memories. Business as usual. This is the narrative of Final Fantasy Legend 3. All of this nonsense is here, and it still has room for a Neko dungeon. Beautiful, or should I say, sugoi. There's also the final boss, where you use an airship to bombard a demonic potato sack. He was supposed to be some important guy, but who cares? More importantly, its name is SaGa, and come on, you can't have an evil space creature in a 90s RPG without having an X in its name. That's just classic. And in some way, despite it being a convoluted mess, it kinda does embody the spirit of Square's RPGs as a whole. Legend 3 was the swan song of Game Boy Saga before moving further on to more ambitious projects, like Romancing Saga, as well as projects on the WonderSwan itself. The Final Fantasy Legend games offer an interestingly simple look at RPG game design. Legend 1 tackles endurance-based gameplay, Legend 2 is more encounter-based, and Legend 3 follows on with refinement and a culmination of what was learnt, and I found more of an appreciation for old-school RPGs thanks to these games. Looking back on Final Fantasy Legend 3 is like boarding the Talon time-travelling airship itself. In the Japanese version, the vessel is called the Stephalos, based on a location in H.P. Lovecraft's novels, a destination found in a fictional dimension of time. Much like that location, Legend 3 can also refer to a point in time after Square's initial success with Final Fantasy IV, and before they followed up with even more lavish RPGs like the aforementioned Romancing Saga, Secret of Mana, and more fantasies to come. Even today you can trace back the intricate, ambitious, unhinged productions of Kingdom Hearts 3 and Final Fantasy VII Remake all the way to Final Fantasy Legend 3 on the Game Boy. And you know, maybe it's fitting that Legend 3 acted as a bridge between the Final Fantasy and SaGa series, because this series of videos was also never meant to just be a trilogy. Oh yeah, I've had my sights on an octology. So hopefully you'll stick around to hear my wild thematic hot takes on these fantastic gems real soon. Goodbye.